Can Europe stop the dependency or reduce the dependency on natural gas from Russia? Obviously it can, but it will be significantly more expensive, and we need to understand why. Europe's dependency on natural gas from Russia is a codependency system. Europe needs that gas because it's extremely cheap. It's up to 10 times more affordable than other alternatives, and certainly more affordable than any other alternative. And Russia needs Europe to sell it because it's not easy to sell it over to China. It costs billions of investments in order to send it over, and it's not an easy alternative. So first, the reason why Europe depends on natural gas imports from Russia is because it's extremely cheap. Second, it can reduce the dependency and import from other alternatives. Which other alternatives? The United States can deliver about 50 BCM, Norway and the North Sea can deliver as well, and certainly a diversified pool of suppliers coming from Qatar, Algeria, Israel, etc. Numerous countries can send over liquefied natural gas. The network of regasification terminals of the European Union is strong enough to offset those imports from Russia at, obviously, a significantly higher price. Renewables are not an alternative. Germany has proven that it's not an alternative after spending hundreds of billions of euros in investments in renewables and depending more on natural gas from Russia and on lignite. The reality is that you cannot offset a source of energy that is reliable, constant, and that works 100% of the time with technologies that are intermittent, volatile, and dependent on the weather. It's going to generate a massive problem of security of supply constantly because it's unreliable and unpredictable. On top of it, if one decided to invest massively in renewables, we need to understand the enormous cost in the grid network, and if one decided to use the alternative of batteries, it would cost around 2.5 trillion euros to the European Union to place a large network of batteries, and that in itself also would make Europe massively dependent on China. Aluminum, lithium, rare earths, etc. All of the different raw materials that are required for those different alternatives of supply are imported from China massively. Additionally, we need to understand that the security of supply and competitiveness of energy policy comes not from interventionism, not from trying to limit resources, but from adding more sources of supply, from adding better sources of supply and more diversified ones with competitive and industrial logic behind it. So what Europe needs is not to think about destroying demand, as we have seen in some reports that would lead inevitably to a crisis in Europe. What it needs is to have reliable and competitive sources of supply in all technologies, be it nuclear, own resources of gas. Let's remember that the European Union banned the development of its own resources of gas recently. Also wind, solar, and obviously hydro, as well as oil. So what makes you less dependent on a supplier is to have all of the alternatives working together in order to guarantee security of supply and competitiveness. What always leads to more dependency is to do what Germany did. Germany shut down its nuclear fleet. It increased massively its investments in renewables. All of that generated a higher dependency on natural gas and a higher dependency on coal and lignite in periods in which weather conditions and the reality of the intermittent and volatile nature of renewables leads to issues with security of supply. Therefore, we need to understand that intervention is not going to solve the problem. That a dependency on Russia will continue as long as we don't think about competitiveness and security of supply with an industrial, not political logic. That ideology doesn't solve problems for consumers, that it's actually making it worse for consumers. And that the numerous alternatives need to be able to compete adequately in order precisely to improve prices for consumers. As long as Russia sees that the European Union shoots itself in the foot by banning its own domestic resources, by banning nuclear, by putting brakes on competitiveness, limiting imports from other sources, and generating problems with taxation and regulation that make it more difficult for the alternatives to appear and to compete, it will know that Russian gas is the only viable alternative. So that's what we need to do. We need to forget about ideology and think more about industry.